Just a temp nurse. That's what Dr. Blackwell had said in the break room that morning, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man accustomed to being heard. She'll quit within a week. I'm betting my lunch money on it. The physician's lounge had gone quiet, the way rooms do when someone with institutional power draws a line in the sand. Rachel Torres hadn't been there to hear it, but the story found her anyway, passed along by a sympathetic radiology tech who'd witnessed the bet being placed. She was already gone by then, already deep in the ICU where monitors hissed and ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, where the work was too urgent for gossip. They didn't know what her hands could do. They didn't know who they were watching shuffle past in discount store sneakers and scrubs so worn the navy had faded to the color of old rain. What happened next would change everything about that bet. The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial hummed their endless song as Rachel moved through the corridor at 6:13 a.m., before the day's shift had fully awakened. Her left hand trembled slightly as she pushed the medication cart, an old habit, a ghost from 12 years ago, but the tremor was a detail only she noticed, something that lived in the privacy of her body and went dormant the moment she touched a patient. The hospital smelled of antiseptic layered over something else, something copper and organic that never quite washed away no matter how much bleach the cleaning crew applied. She'd worked in field hospitals where the smell was worse. She'd worked in places where you learned to breathe through your mouth to survive the day. Portland's Oak Creek Memorial was a mercy by comparison, all climate control and protocol, all the violence sanitized and documented and filed away in charts. The ICU door swung inward with a soft pneumatic hiss. 3 beds occupied this corner of the ward, a post-operative coronary bypass patient sleeping chemically, an elderly woman with pneumonia whose oxygen saturation numbers were trending wrong, and a vacant space where someone had been discharged at midnight. Rachel's shift report sat in a plastic folder on the charge nurse station, stable, watch vitals. She'd learned long ago not to trust words like stable. Stable was a state of temporary ceasefire. Stable meant the next crisis was coming, you just didn't know the timing yet. She pulled on fresh gloves, the latex snapping like a gunshot in the quiet, and began her first rounds. At 7:15 a.m., before the code simulation had been announced, before anyone knew Dr. Blackwell was watching, Rachel had already prevented one crisis. The elderly woman, Mrs. Chen, 78, admitted 3 days ago, had begun desaturating around 3 a.m. Rachel noticed the first subtle sign not from the monitor but from the sound of breathing, a wetness in the back of the throat that meant fluid was collecting where it shouldn't be. She'd adjusted the patient's position, increased the oxygen flow from 4 liters to 6, and ordered a stat chest X-ray. By dawn, the radiologist had confirmed early pulmonary edema. By 7 a.m., Mrs. Chen's oxygen saturation had climbed back to 94%. The crisis averted. No fanfare. No one would put it in a journal. It was just nursing, the invisible kind, the work that happened in corridors lit by fluorescent white and accomplished by people no one thought to look at twice. That's when the code simulation was announced over the intercom. A routine practice, quarterly requirement, a chance for the residents to demonstrate competence under pressure. The scenario was a 42-year-old male, blunt force trauma, multi-system injuries. A dummy on a stretcher. A room full of doctors who would perform for each other and prove their worth while nurses quietly ensured the equipment worked and the medications were drawn correctly. Rachel had participated in dozens of these simulations. She knew the choreography. Doctor as conductor, everyone else as section instruments. But something happened in that room that morning. The dummy's chest was opened. The attending physician, not Blackwell, a younger resident named Chen, called out orders with the mechanical precision of someone reciting from textbooks. Epinephrine. Chest compression. Check for tension pneumothorax. The script moved in the expected directions. And then the dummy's internal injuries were exposed, a penetrating trauma to the lower abdomen, and someone asked the question that hung over all of these simulations, what now? Rachel was standing in the corner, out of the way, where nurses belonged during physician demonstrations. She wasn't asked. She hadn't spoken. But when Dr. Chen froze, genuinely froze, because blunt force trauma was one thing and penetrating wounds to the retroperitoneum were another, a place where surgery textbooks gave up and blood loss became philosophy, Rachel moved. Not as a suggestion. As something older than suggestion. Her hands had muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. 3 tours. 200 hours of field medicine in Helmand Province. 1,000 moments of making decisions with your hands because there was no attending to defer to, no hierarchy to navigate, just a patient and your training and the clock ticking down. She stepped forward. Clamshell thoracotomy to access the aorta first, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, clinical, the tone of someone stating observable fact. Satin sky clamp on the descending thoracic aorta. Buy yourself time for resuscitation. She wasn't ordering. She was narrating. But narration from someone whose hands moved as she spoke, demonstrating, showing, not telling. The resident watched. The attending physician watched. And for 3 minutes, everyone in that room understood that they were observing something different from what they'd expected to see. Afterward, and this was the part that would matter later, Dr. Blackwell had been standing in the observation window the entire time. He'd arrived during the scenario's middle phase, coffee cup in hand, and watched the demonstration with the careful attention of a man cataloguing weakness in others. When it ended, he lingered. When Rachel stepped back into her proper place against the wall, her tremor returning to her left hand now that the work was done, Dr. Blackwell's expression had shifted. Not respect. Never that. Instead, something harder, the look of someone who'd seen a threat to his institutional hierarchy and was already calculating how to neutralize it. The physician's lounge that morning smelled of stale coffee and pastries from the hospital cafeteria. Rachel wasn't there, but she would hear about it later, the way information moves through the ecosystem of a hospital. Dr. Blackwell had positioned himself at the coffee station, the epicenter of morning ritual, where decisions got made and hierarchies got reinforced. A small group of residents and attending physicians were clustered around him, the usual morning assembly of men in white coats who got to dictate the shape of other people's days. I'm betting my lunch, Dr. Blackwell had announced, his voice clear and intended for the broader crowd, that the temp from the night shift quits within 7 days. He'd paused, letting the statement settle. Anyone want to take that bet? She's competent enough, maybe, but she's temp. No stability. No commitment. These people always wash out. He'd taken a long pull of his coffee then, the gesture of a man who'd already won an argument he'd started alone. The other physicians had laughed or not laughed, some had registered the comment with the discomfort of people who recognized cruelty when they saw it and had chosen to participate anyway. The bet was placed. The line was drawn. He'd already decided what would happen next. Rachel had felt the shift in the ward the moment the word filtered down. The way some of the residents stopped making eye contact. The way one of the junior nurses had pulled her aside and said, "Just so you know, he's like that with everyone. It's not personal." The kindness of that warning was almost worse than the insult itself, because it meant she was supposed to accept hostility as normal, as the weather, as something unchangeable. She'd made a small sound that was not quite agreement and returned to her charts. During her break, and breaks were always stolen things, 15 minutes grabbed between emergencies, sometimes less, Rachel had sat in the women's locker room and pulled off her jacket. The weight of it was familiar, the scrape of it against her shoulders something she'd carried so long it had become invisible. She'd turned it inside out, the way she did sometimes when the weight of things got heavy, and found the patch where she'd sewn it carefully 12 years ago, right before the court-martial, right before everything had changed. It was faded now, the colors of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force emblem barely visible against the worn lining. 2 tiny crossed swords and an anchor, the insignia of a command she wasn't supposed to remember, a rank she wasn't supposed to claim, a life that had been classified and then erased. Her thumb traced the stitching she'd done herself, back in quarters at Camp Lejeune, precise and careful because if you were going to keep a secret you kept it well. 72 hours. That's what the court-martial had been about, though the actual charges remained sealed, classified, a piece of history that belonged to a vault somewhere in the Pentagon and to her own memory, which was the same thing when you were the only one allowed to remember it. 72 hours she'd held a field hospital in Helmand Province against Taliban assault. 214 Marines and civilian personnel in a compound that wasn't designed for siege. 308 casualties treated across that time. 72 hours because after that, Admiral Peter Grath had arrived and ordered the evacuation and blamed her for the losses that happened during his withdrawal, court-martialed her on charges that couldn't be explained without revealing classified operations, and accepted her silence because the alternative was explaining what had really happened that night in the Sanjin Valley. She was alive because she'd been willing to be erased. That was the bargain. That was the deal that had brought her to Portland, Oregon, working double shifts at a hospital, living in a studio apartment with a succulent plant and a photograph of someone she wasn't supposed to remember, working as a temp because permanent employment required background checks that would trigger red flags all the way to NCIS. She was alive and invisible. She was alive and she'd made her peace with that. Or she had until this morning, until Dr. Blackwell had made his bet, had declared war on someone he hadn't even bothered to know. She'd folded the jacket carefully, tucking the patch back against the lining, and returned to the ICU where Mrs. Chen was beginning her recovery and where the next crisis was already building like weather on the horizon. The shift continued. The work continued. The invisible work that happened in corridors where no one was watching, where the real medicine got done, where the people who weren't supposed to be competent saved lives anyway, one breath at a time. But that afternoon, when the admission list came through for evening intake, Rachel's entire body had gone still. Room 347. Transferred from Naval Medical Center for cardiac monitoring and post-operative evaluation. Admitted under the name Admiral Peter Grath, United States Navy. The man who destroyed her 12 years ago had just arrived in the hospital where she was working, where her competence had been declared temporary, where she was scheduled to fail. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The cafeteria smelled like overcooked chicken and stale coffee, the kind of smell that clung to your scrubs no matter how many times you washed them. Rachel Torres balanced her tray with practiced efficiency, wilted salad, black coffee, a blueberry muffin she'd steal bites from between charting sessions, when Dr. Blackwell's shoulder connected with her spine like a deliberate blow. The collision sent her tray airborne. Plastic utensils scattered across the tile floor like shrapnel. The coffee cup hit hard and split open, dark liquid spreading in a pool the shape of blood spatter. A dozen hospital staff stood frozen around the beverage station, watching. "Oh, sweetheart," Blackwell said, his voice dripping with concern loud enough for everyone to hear. "You should watch where you're going." He smiled at the crowd. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Rachel knelt on the cold tile, her knees pressing into the hard floor, and began collecting the pieces. 1 plastic fork. 2 spoons. A handful of napkins soaked through with coffee. She moved methodically, the way she'd been trained to move through rubble and chaos, each motion precise, each breath controlled. A single tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before anyone could frame it as weakness, maintained eye contact with the spreading pool of coffee on the floor, and said nothing. Blackwell watched her for another 3 seconds, then walked away, shoulders back, satisfied that he'd successfully demonstrated dominance in front of witnesses. She didn't move for 7 seconds after he left. 7 seconds of kneeling. 7 seconds of breathing. 7 seconds of remembering that Helmand Province had taught her how to swallow rage so complete it could burn through steel. Then she stood, disposed of the ruined tray, and walked back to the ICU without a word. The other nurses avoided her eyes. Pity was almost worse than the insult. The next morning, at 0630 hours, Blackwell orchestrated his second move. This time it was surgical. Rachel approached the nurse's station to check the surgical schedule. She was assigned to pre-op assessments, when Blackwell swept his arm across the desk with calculated casualness. A stack of patient charts exploded outward, paper cascading across the tile in an explosion of institutional chaos. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and smiled at her with the kind of expression that came from knowing you had allies, institutional power, and zero consequences. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. "What else are temps good for?" Rachel stood motionless for 1 measured breath. Then 2. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as a surgical laser. A single tear tracked down her left cheek, not from sadness, but from the pressure building behind her eyes, the kind of pressure that came from holding a field hospital together while Taliban bullets tore through the walls, from watching good people bleed out on unsterile floors, from accepting a court-martial rather than reveal the classified operation that might have exonerated her. She wiped the tear away deliberately, maintaining eye contact with Blackwell the entire time. Not breaking. Not flinching. Not giving him the satisfaction. "I've picked up after bigger messes than you, Doctor," she said quietly, her voice steady and devastating, each word placed like a blade between his ribs. "Much bigger messes." Then she turned and returned to entering medication orders into the system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with perfect precision while Blackwell's smile faltered for the first time. He stood there for 3 seconds, long enough for Rachel to know that something had shifted, that his calculation had miscalculated. Then he walked away, and the nurse's station exhaled. But that wasn't the worst part. The real power play came at midshift, when Blackwell found her in the ICU. "Administration has concerns," he said, voice casual but eyes cold. "VIP patients need careful handling. Your enthusiastic attention to the Admiral makes some people nervous." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, the way surgeons looked at complications. "I'll be managing his care personally. You'll stick to MedSurg effective immediately." Rachel nodded without speaking. Admiral Peter Grath was now completely off limits. Blackwell had just neutralized her access to the one patient she was embedded here to monitor, the one man who could confirm or deny Naval Intelligence's suspicions about security leaks through the veterans ward. This wasn't cruelty anymore. This was tactical, calculated institutional sabotage disguised as professional concern. That night, Rachel sat alone in the break room, staring at a text from her daughter asking how work was going. Sarah was a sophomore at Berkeley, studying environmental science, completely unaware that her mother was a decorated combat officer operating under a false identity. Rachel typed and deleted 3 responses, "Fine, sweetie, busy shift, everything's good," before settling on the shortest truth she could manage, "Fine, honey." Her left hand trembled as she set the phone down. The tremor had gotten worse. 12 years of holding it together, and the stress of being in the same building as Admiral Grath was breaking something inside her that she'd learned to suppress back in Helmand Province, back when showing weakness meant your entire unit died. She pulled her jacket from her locker. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn into the lining where it had been hidden for 12 years, the only physical proof of who she really was, of the 72-hour siege where she'd held a field hospital together with sheer will and surgical tape, where she'd made impossible triage decisions, where she'd lost Lieutenant Sarah Jen to a sniper round that went through the operating tent's canvas wall like it was butter. At 0200 hours, Rachel's phone buzzed. Her ICU alert app, the one she monitored even though she'd been reassigned to MedSurg. Admiral Grath's room. Cardiac alarm active. Tachycardia increasing. Rhythm deteriorating. She moved before conscious thought could stop her, her feet carrying her down the hallway in the dark, past the security guard who was checking his phone and missed her entirely. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song as she moved, a sound like power lines hissing, like the electrical current that ran through everything in this hospital, including her own nervous system right now, firing warnings her body couldn't ignore. She was through Grath's door in 17 seconds. His monitors showed an irregular rhythm, heart rate climbing toward 140, oxygen saturation dropping steadily. His skin had taken on the grey-white pallor of someone whose blood was clotting, whose body was turning against itself. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment the years collapsed. The field hospital. The court-martial. The man whose testimony had destroyed her career and sent her into 12 years of hiding. "Admiral," she said, voice completely level, the tremor in her hands gone now because her body had recognized that this was combat, and combat was the one thing she knew how to survive. "Colonel," he said back, and in that single word was recognition, regret, and the understanding that whatever was happening between them in this moment would change everything. Behind the monitors, below the visible surface of institutional protocol and professional distance, Rachel's mind was already running differential diagnosis. Pulmonary embolism. The symptoms matched perfectly: the tachycardia, the dropping O2 sat, the irregular rhythm from cardiac strain. A clot somewhere in his lungs, probably formed from bedrest, probably forming right now in his femoral vein, probably traveling toward his heart like a time bomb with a countdown nobody could see. Dr. Blackwell would never reach him in time. Blackwell was off shift, probably sleeping in a bed that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. By the time someone paged him, by the time he dragged himself down to the ICU and tried to manage a critical event he'd been too busy playing office politics to monitor properly, Admiral Peter Grath would be dead. Rachel reached for the crash cart phone. The cardiac monitor in room 347 had been humming its steady, reassuring rhythm all evening until Rachel pushed through the double doors with the evening vitals cart. She'd been assigned to check the new admission's blood pressure and oxygen saturation at 9 o'clock, a routine task that Dr. Blackwell had explicitly removed from her responsibilities that afternoon. The chart clipped to the bed-read Admiral Peter Grath, age 67, admitted for cardiac workup after chest pains at his home. Her hand steadied against the cart rail. 12 years. That face had aged into deeper lines around the eyes, silver threading through dark hair, but the jaw was unmistakable. The same man who'd sat at the head of a court-martial proceeding in a base legal office outside Helmand Province, his expression carved from stone as he listened to testimony that condemned her for a classified operation she couldn't defend. The same man who'd stripped her of rank and honor with a signature on a form. Admiral Grath's eyes opened as her shadow crossed his face. Recognition flickered there too, a moment of hesitation, a question forming behind his gaze. Rachel's voice remained level, clinical. "Checking vitals, sir." She didn't give him time to speak, moving with practiced efficiency to slip the blood pressure cuff around his arm. The monitor's soft beeping continued its rhythm. 84/52. Normal. Oxygen saturation 96% on room air. Everything stable. She documented the numbers on his chart without meeting his eyes again, though she felt the weight of his stare following her as she exited. The faded unit patch hidden inside her jacket lining seemed to pulse against her ribs like a second heartbeat, a reminder of the life that had been stolen, the command she'd lost, the 17 Marines under her care in that field hospital who depended on decisions only she could make. By 2:30 in the morning, the ICU had that particular silence that only comes in the deep night hours, when the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn and the building itself seemed to hold its breath. Rachel was in the break room restocking the crash cart medications when the first alert came through the overhead speaker. It wasn't her patient. It couldn't be her patient. She'd been reassigned that afternoon, pulled from Admiral Grath's care rotation by Dr. Blackwell's order, replaced by a second-year resident named Kovac who'd spent the shift documenting lab values and making rounds according to protocol. The second alert made her move anyway. Code Blue, room 347. Pulmonary complications. She was through the ICU doors before conscious thought could stop her, muscle memory overriding policy. The room was still quiet when she arrived, which meant the monitor had just alarmed. Admiral Grath's face was grey, the color of concrete, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow gasps. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time on the monitor, 94, 92, 89. The sound was wrong. A wet, rattling breath that meant his lungs were filling with fluid, the classic presentation of massive pulmonary embolism. A blood clot had lodged in his pulmonary artery, choking off the flow of blood to his lungs, and his heart was beginning to fail under the impossible load. His monitor showed atrial fibrillation, dangerous and chaotic, his blood pressure already starting its descent. "Call a code," Rachel said to the resident who'd appeared in the doorway, eyes wide and uncertain. "Get respiratory. Get surgery. Move." Kovac hesitated. She moved past him to the bedside, already reaching for the crash cart that had been wheeled in moments before. Grath's hand reached toward her, fingers grasping, his mouth working around words that wouldn't come. His oxygen was 78 now. Dropping like a stone. He went into full cardiac arrest before the code team arrived, his heart stopping entirely, the monitor flatline, his body going utterly still. Rachel didn't wait for Dr. Blackwell. She didn't wait for permission she knew wouldn't be granted. She reached for the thoracotomy tray, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who'd done this before in mud and blood and firelight in a field hospital with no surgical team, only her hands and her knowledge and 23 minutes to save a life that everyone else had given up on. The betadine bottle hissed as she poured it across his exposed chest, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the antiseptic staleness of the ICU. Her knife found the space between his ribs, the fourth intercostal space, left side, her incision swift and sure, muscle memory taking over from her time commanding a combat surgical unit with 300 documented saves. The retractor spread his ribs open, a wet sound like wetwood splitting, and Rachel's fingers found his heart. It was motionless in his chest cavity, a fist-sized organ grey and failing, and her hands began their compressions with the rhythm and precision that had kept 17 Marines alive through their worst hours. Compress, release, compress, release. The direct cardiac massage was almost extinct in American hospitals. Surgical teams preferred closed chest compressions and medication protocols, but on a forward operating base in Sanjin Valley, with no EKG and no ultrasound and a Marine with a sucking chest wound, it was the only thing that worked. Her fingers moved against the slick organ, feeling the walls give beneath the pressure, encouraging the blood to move, to flow, to do the work the arrested heart could no longer manage. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto her mask. Her shoulders burned with the repetitive motion. The room had gone absolutely silent except for the sound of her compressions and her steady breathing. Dr. Blackwell stood in the doorway, visible through the glass partition, his face draining of color as he watched. His mouth moved, no words came out. He looked frozen, the way a man looks when confronted with something that shattered his entire understanding of the person in front of him. Other staff crowded the observation window. 2 ICU nurses, a resident, the respiratory therapist who'd arrived with his bag. All of them watching this temp nurse command the code with military precision, watching her reach into a man's chest cavity with hands that didn't shake and fingers that knew exactly what they were doing. 40 seconds. That's all it took. Rachel felt the subtle shift beneath her fingers, a flutter, then a stronger beat, then a rhythm that found its own momentum. "I have a pulse," she said, her voice steady as she glanced at the monitor. The flatline jumped into coherent sinus rhythm, 82 beats per minute, and his blood pressure bloomed back into numbers compatible with life. 92/60. Not perfect, but alive. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said without looking up from Grath's chest. 2 units of O negative, start the rapid infuser. Her hands didn't stop moving. The incision needed closure, the bleeding needed control, and the probability that a massive PE would kill him again within the hour was higher than she wanted to contemplate. But not right now. Right now she was a surgeon. Right now she was a commander making decisions that measured the difference between death and survival. The sutures were Navy surplus material, the kind that had held under field conditions in worse circumstances than this sterile hospital room. She closed his chest with 10 sutures, efficient and clean, and stepped back to allow the ICU team to transfer him to the CQ, the cardiac intensive care unit, where he'd need continuous monitoring, anticoagulation, and a full evaluation for clot removal. As they moved him out, Rachel stripped her bloody gloves with controlled movements, disposing of them in the red biohazard container. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. The adrenaline that had turned her body into an instrument of precise medical violence drained away, leaving only the cool aftermath, the strange calm that follows when you've stared at death and refused to blink first. Through the glass partition, Dr. Blackwell was already on his phone. His jaw moved in rapid speech, his eyes never leaving Rachel's face as she documented the code on the medical record, her handwriting neat and clinical. She'd noted the time of arrest, the time of defibrillation, the drugs administered, the procedure performed, everything by protocol, everything by the book, everything defensible. But she knew what she'd just done. She'd saved a patient she wasn't authorized to touch. She'd performed a procedure that required surgical approval. She'd overstepped the boundaries that Blackwell had so carefully drawn around her that afternoon, and she'd done it in front of witnesses. He made another call. Then another. By the time she finished her documentation, there were 4 phone calls logged on his recent call history, each one a small brick in the wall he was building, each one a carefully chosen word designed to frame her intervention as insubordination rather than heroism. But that wasn't the worst part. By dawn, Dr. Blackwell had already made 4 phone calls. The first went to the chief of ICU services at 6:17 a.m., his voice smooth as polished marble. "I have concerns about staff competency in the Grath case. I'd like the overnight team rotated out immediately." The second call, 7 minutes later, targeted surgical scheduling, remove the temp nurse from Admiral Grath's post-op team. "We need protocol compliance, not improvisation." His third call came at 6:42, to the OR director, each sentence a small brick in a wall constructed from half-truths and strategic silence. The fourth call, the one that would matter most, went to the chief medical officer at 6:58 a.m., 14 minutes before the morning shift began. "I need to report a serious patient safety concern," Blackwell said, his tone carrying the weight of a man burdened by professional duty. The temp nurse in ICU, Rachel Torres, performed an authorized surgical intervention last night. Cracked the patient's chest at bedside without physician oversight. Emergency decompression, I understand, but the scope creep is concerning. And there's something else. He paused, letting silence do its work. She has unusual familiarity with this particular patient. Admiral Grath. I'd almost call it excessive. Makes me wonder about her background, her credentials, whether she's been fully vetted. The chief medical officer listened. Blackwell knew he would. Because Blackwell spoke the language of liability, of malpractice insurance, of hospital accreditation. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He performed concern like a man who'd perfected the art. By 8:30 a.m., the ICU staff had been reassigned. By 9:15, the surgical schedule had been scrubbed, Rachel's name removed from every post-operative assignment for the next 6 weeks. By 10 a.m., Blackwell had already been given an update. The CMO wanted to speak with Rachel at 1400 hours. The call came at 13:55. Rachel was restocking the supply cart outside room 347, her hands moving with mechanical precision, gauze, syringes, saline flushes, when her pager buzzed. She didn't need to read the message. Nobody paged you to the CMO's office for praise. The hospital corridors felt narrower as she walked. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electric song above her head. Her discount sneakers squeaked softly against the tile, a sound she'd never noticed before, or perhaps a sound she'd simply accepted, the way she'd accepted so many small indignities. Her badge caught the light. The name read R. Torres RN in simple grey letters. No designation. No history. Just a temp. The CMO's office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the parking lot. Rachel had never been inside. The door was oak, expensive-looking, the kind of door that separated administrative power from bedside reality. She knocked. The invitation came immediately, as if the chief medical officer had been waiting. Dr. Patricia Huang was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular exhaustion that came from trying to run a hospital while satisfying both physicians and boards. She didn't invite Rachel to sit. "Your employment contract is being terminated effective immediately," Dr. Huang said, sliding a letter across her desk with 2 fingers. The paper felt heavier than paper should. "Dr. Blackwell has raised serious concerns about your conduct. Performing surgical procedures outside your scope of practice. Unauthorized access to restricted patients. Questions about your credibility and, frankly, your background." Rachel's hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She'd been trained in rooms where showing reaction meant death, for herself, for people depending on her. The mask held. "I saved his life," Rachel said quietly. "You overstepped," the CMO replied. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings." There was nothing more to say. Nothing that wouldn't reveal what couldn't be revealed. The mission. The embedded status. Naval intelligence. The fact that Rachel had spent 6 months as someone's temporary nurse in order to investigate security leaks through the veterans ward, and Admiral Peter Grath, the man who destroyed her 12 years ago, had turned out to be the key to everything. She couldn't tell Dr. Huang that. Couldn't say the words that would have explained everything. The security guard who walked her to her locker was apologetic, soft-voiced, embarrassed to be escorting anyone anywhere. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," he said. Rachel didn't respond. Some things didn't deserve response. The locker was small, metal, painted institutional grey. She'd never decorated it. Temporary people didn't put up pictures or magnets or anything that suggested permanence. She found a cardboard box in the break room, the kind that had held surgical supplies, now repurposed. It still smelled faintly of antiseptic. The cracked mug went in first. Ceramic with a painted palm tree and the words "Mom's Trip to Maui" in faded yellow letters. Emma had given it to her 3 years ago at her college graduation, insisting that every mother needed something ridiculous in her dorm room care package. Rachel had never been to Maui. She'd been in Helmand Province when Emma graduated, thousands of miles away, watching the ceremony on video call with shaking internet connection. The mug had traveled with her through 3 apartments, a divorce, 2 career transitions, and an entire classified military deployment. The dying succulent came next. Brown-tipped leaves, soil that hadn't seen water in weeks, the kind of plant that thrived on neglect. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd rescued it from a hospital gift shop where it was marked down to 79 cents. Rescue the rescuer, she'd thought with something like dark humor. The photo came last. Lieutenant Sarah Chen in desert fatigues, smiling at the camera with the particular brightness of someone who still believed in the future. This was the photo Rachel looked at every morning and every night. This was the reason she'd accepted the court-martial 12 years ago instead of revealing the classified operation that might have saved her career but would have burned Sarah's entire team. Sarah had been killed in an ambush 3 days after this photo was taken. 26 years old. Engaged. Planning a wedding on the coast of North Carolina for October that never happened. Rachel placed the photo carefully in the box. Her hands were steady. They'd learned steadiness in places that most people would never see. The other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. They'd seen the efficiency with which she could make a crisis disappear, the way she moved through codes with the precision of someone who'd been performing emergency medicine when most of them were still in nursing school. They'd whispered about her, Rachel knew. Wondered. Speculated. But wonder and speculation were always safer than the truth. Dr. Blackwell watched from the physician's lounge window, arms crossed, face satisfied. She could see him reflected in the locker door's small mirror. He was smiling. Not a smile of triumph, something more refined than that. A smile of a man who'd executed a plan with technical perfection. She didn't acknowledge him. Some people didn't deserve acknowledgement either. The box was light when she picked it up. Her entire life at Oak Creek Memorial compressed into cardboard and weight. Security walked her to the main entrance. The afternoon rain had started, the kind of Portland rain that never announced itself, just appeared and stayed. The parking lot was gray. The sky was gray. The world had become a study in shades of concrete. She stood at a bus stop 2 blocks away on Powell Boulevard, clutching the cardboard box as water began seeping through the bottom. Her scrubs were damp. Her discount sneakers, the ones that had cost $19 at a discount retailer, the ones she'd bought because they were practical, not because they meant anything, were soaking through. Cars passed, throwing up sheets of spray that arced across the sidewalk like temporary walls of water. She shifted the box. The succulent tipped inside, soil spilling. She didn't write it. The photo of Sarah remained face down, protected by the crack in the mug. Her phone buzzed. A missed call from a number with a 202 area code. Washington, D.C. She knew what that call meant. She knew what the Naval Intelligence Liaison would say, that operational extraction was pending, that her cover status was blown but her mission data would be preserved, that she should stand by for further instructions. She didn't call back. Another text came through, this one from Emma, Mom, can we talk this weekend? Rachel typed back, of course, honey, then watched the rain dissolve the cardboard corner of her box, fiber by fiber, returning it to the nothing from which it came. The bus was 17 minutes late. She didn't check the time. She just stood there, holding a box that was falling apart in the rain, thinking about the faded unit patch still sewn inside her jacket lining, the jacket that hung in her apartment closet, waiting. She could cut it out. Burn it. Forget it existed. Everyone else wanted her to forget. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 2 days later, when the windows of her apartment rattled and the sound of helicopter rotors filled the sky above Portland, and everything she'd tried to keep hidden came rushing into the light like a current too strong to resist. Dr. Blackwell's office door closed with a soft click, the blind snapping shut against the grey Portland afternoon. His hands moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, muscle memory from 1,000 late nights reviewing charts and covering tracks. The security system interface glowed before him, a landscape of timestamps and file names stretching back months. He knew exactly where to start. The cafeteria footage from 3 weeks ago. The angle from the hallway where she'd bent to retrieve scattered charts, where he'd watched her composure not crack. Where $50 had changed hands in the physician's lounge. Where the bet had been made in front of 12 witnesses. Delete. 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 His breathing came shallow and quick, nothing like the controlled calm he'd cultivated for 23 years of medical practice. The mouse cursor hovered over the timestamp of her final humiliation, the moment he'd smiled at her and watched for shame to bloom across her face. It hadn't. That was what infuriated him most. That moment should have broken her. Instead it had simply revealed him. He clicked through the archive. One by one, the moments of his campaign dissolved from the system. The shoulder check collision. The chart scattering incident. The physician's lounge footage. Gone. 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 His heart rate climbed with each deletion, adrenaline flooding his system like the body had learned to expect, fight or flight, win or lose, and he would not lose. Not to some temp nurse with calloused hands and military-issue boots. Not to someone without a name, without credentials, without the kind of pedigree that mattered in this hospital. 37 minutes into the deletion sequence, an alert pinged on his screen. Unusual activity detected in security access logs. He paused. Clicked through to the alert source. The IT department. Marcus Webb, IT Security Administrator. 3 tours in Fallujah. 2 Purple Hearts. The kind of man who could trace digital footprints with the same precision he'd once traced convoy routes through hostile territory. Blackwell felt his stomach contract. By the time he'd finished his deletions and leaned back in his chair with a breath of manufactured relief, Marcus Webb had already copied every single frame of footage Blackwell had tried to erase. Not once. 3 times. 3 external drives, each labeled meticulously with dates and incident descriptions. The backup files resided on secured cloud servers accessible only to Marcus and the Oregon Medical Board. Marcus had already made the phone call, his voice steady and factual as a mission briefing, describing what he'd witnessed in those deleted files. A deliberate campaign. A pattern of escalation. A woman being systematically humiliated by a man with institutional power and zero accountability. The chief medical officer didn't knock. She pushed into Blackwell's office like a current too strong to stop, her jaw set, her eyes the color of burnished steel. Sandra Chen. 15 years at Oak Creek Memorial. A woman who'd built her career on protection, not politics. Tell me you didn't just delete security footage, she said, and it wasn't a question. Tell me you didn't systematically harass a decorated combat veteran and then try to erase the evidence. Blackwell's face went the color of old bone. The hospital board emergency session convened for that afternoon in the executive conference room on the administrative floor. Blackwell wasn't invited. Sandra Chen presented the timeline. Rachel Torres terminated the day after saving Admiral Peter Grath's life. Reassignment of all ICU staff who'd witnessed the intervention. Strategic phone calls made by Blackwell in the 24-hour window before termination. The footage from security, all of it preserved, all of it irrefutable. The resident who'd heard the $50 bet made public. The cafeteria worker who'd seen the tray collision. 3 separate ICU nurses who documented the reassignments in their shift logs. The pattern was so clear, so deliberate, that no board member had to ask if it was intentional. Intent was written across every calculated moment. Then Admiral Peter Grath walked into the conference room in navy dress blues, his recovered frame still thin but bearing itself with the weight of command, and the temperature in the room shifted. He brought his own legal team, 2 JAG officers and a paralegal from Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He sat across the mahogany table and began to speak. Helmand Province. Sanjin Valley. 2012. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd survived things this hospital would never understand. Colonel Rachel Torres commanded a surgical trauma unit at Forward Operating Base Shank with 4 surgeons, 18 corpsmen, and enough courage to hold a field hospital for 72 hours during a Taliban assault. 327 personnel processed through her unit. 241 saved. That's a 73% survival rate in an active combat zone. Do you understand what that means? That means she had hands steady enough to perform emergency thoracotomies under fire. That means she had the judgment to prioritize 63 patients who would have died under standard medical protocol. That means she saved lives most of your surgeons couldn't save in a sterile operating room with unlimited blood supply and anesthesia. He paused. The room held its breath. I made a mistake 12 years ago. I believed false intelligence. I court-martialed her based on classified information that was wrong. It took a decade for the truth to surface. And when it did, I spent another 2 years finding the woman I'd wronged, because she disappeared. Changed her name. Became someone no one would ever look for. Started over as a temp nurse making $17 an hour in a hospital where no one would recognize her. He leaned forward. Your hospital employed a combat surgeon and treated her like temporary staff. Your hospital employed a war hero and humiliated her. And when she saved my life, when she performed open cardiac massage at bedside with a precision that only comes from having done it on battlefields, your chief of surgery tried to have her removed from the case. The board members didn't move. Didn't blink. She saved my life twice, Grath continued quietly. Once in Helmand. Once in your ICU. And your hospital fired her for it. Dr. Blackwell received the notice of investigation by certified mail. Medical Board. Professional Conduct Standards violation. Suspension pending formal review. By week 3, his hospital privileges were revoked. By week 6, his malpractice insurance carrier, having reviewed the security footage and the board testimony, terminated his coverage. By month 3, the Oregon Medical Board opened a formal ethics investigation into his conduct, his documentation practices, and a pattern of abusive behavior toward subordinate staff spanning the past 8 years. 14 former employees came forward with their own stories. The pattern was consistent. The abuse was systemic. The protection he'd relied on, his connections, his credentials, his presumed invulnerability, had dissolved like morning fog. By month 6, his medical license carried a formal censure. His hospital credentials were permanently revoked. His position at Oak Creek Memorial was terminated for cause. His name appeared in the National Practitioner Data Bank with a permanent flag. No hospital in the region would touch him. But Rachel stood on the deck of the USS Nimitz as it sliced through the Pacific, her navy dress uniform crisp and sharp, the blue fabric pristine against her skin. The collar devices felt unfamiliar after 12 years, Lieutenant Colonel insignia, the weight of restored rank, the physical reality of validation that had taken a decade to earn. Admiral Grath stood beside her, his hand steady as he reached for the shoulder boards, preparing to pin her collar devices himself. This was the moment he'd worked 12 years to orchestrate. The moment the classified court-martial would be officially vacated. The moment her rank would be permanently restored. I can't give you back the years, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that whipped across the flight deck. But I can give you this. He pinned the first collar device. Lieutenant Colonel. Combat Surgeon. The rank she'd earned in blood and sacrifice in Helmand Province. The military brass gleamed against the blue cloth, and for the first time in 12 years, Rachel Torres wasn't hiding. The faded unit patch that had lived inside her jacket lining, the patch she'd worn against her heart every single day, now hung properly on her chest, visible and real and officially recognized. Her daughter Emma stood nearby in civilian clothes, seeing her mother in uniform for the first time in her life. Seeing the woman who'd worked double shifts in discount sneakers and temp agency contracts finally wearing the identity she'd never been allowed to claim. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but Rachel didn't look at her. Rachel looked toward the horizon where Portland's grey skyline was disappearing into the distance, being replaced by endless blue water. She was sailing toward open ocean. Sailing toward a new assignment, command of the Navy's new Combat Trauma Training Center, where she would train the next generation of battlefield surgeons in the techniques that had saved 327 lives. Admiral Grath saluted her with the respect due to her rank. She returned it with the precision of someone who'd never stopped being a soldier, even when the world had tried to erase her. In Portland, Dr. Blackwell stood behind the counter of a strip mall urgent care clinic, checking a child's throat for strep between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. The medical assistant kept calling him Dr. Blackwood. He didn't correct her anymore. His name had become something to hide, just as he'd forced Rachel Torres to hide hers. The rejection emails from hospital human resources departments arrived with mechanical regularity. His name was flagged in every medical database in the region. Permanent marker. Permanent stain. The Nimitz horn sounded across the water, a sound like warning and farewell and beginning all at once. Rachel touched the unit patch on her chest, no longer hidden, no longer secret. The same patch she'd worn for 12 years. The same unit where she'd lost Lieutenant Sarah Chen, whose photograph now hung in her quarters not as contraband but as a memorial. As an official record of sacrifice. As part of her new authority. On the flight deck, Admiral Grath raised his voice across the assembled crew. "True class," he said, and Rachel felt the words land like a benediction, "is what you do when the lights go out." He was looking directly at her. The crew applauded. The water churned beneath the hull. The carrier moved toward open ocean, toward new missions, toward a future that had finally been reclaimed. Rachel looked not back at the city that had tried to break her, but forward toward the horizon. Her command began tomorrow. The medical training center would bear her name. The next generation of combat surgeons would learn from her hands, her experience, her sacrifice. She was, at last, going home. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Walked away after that first humiliation, or stay to face the man who destroyed you? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who change everything.